good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. I am delighted to welcome you all for this very, very important webinar looking at why data has become a national security issue. My name is Aaron Shull. I'm the General Counsel and Managing Director at the Centre for International Governance Innovation based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. We're a public policy research institute, or a think tank, that focuses on emerging issues of global governance and technology. To say that data governance and national security are emerging issues in technology governance at a global level would probably be the understatement of this webinar. Before we really begin, though, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for New American Security, the Data Governance Hub, the Institute for International Economic Policy, the Internet Society of Washington, D.C., the World Wide Web Foundation, and the Institute for Science and Technology at GWU. Now, we have three speakers today that are all deeply impressive, and I won't go through long biographies, but because if I did, that would take up the entire hour. To say that these three panelists are accomplished would really, again, be an understatement. So we will first begin with Carrie Cordero, who is the Robert M. Gates Senior Fellow and General Counsel at the Center for New American Security. Our next speaker will be Colonel Sarah Albrycht, Senior Military Fellow at CNAS and Colonel in the U.S. Army. And our last speaker is Susan Aaronson, who is a GWU Professor, Director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and a Senior Fellow at our think tank, CIGI. Now, in terms of process, each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions once they've concluded their remarks. You can ask a question by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom, and we will try and our very best to answer it. Your question gets process, but the rest of the group can't see them until they've actually been answered. So feel free. One thing we know whose question we're answering, so we can do our best to situate the question and to answer it as effectively as possible. Again, in terms of process, this webinar will be recorded and later it will be viewable at DataGovHub's YouTube channel, and a link will be emailed to participants in the next few days. So, so without further ado, I'd like to first turn to Carrie Cordero, who's going to situate the concept of data as a national security issue for us. Carrie, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the Data Governance Hub for sponsoring this conversation. I'm delighted to join my colleagues for it. So just put it in a little bit of context and perspective. At a very, very high level of generality, for perhaps the past 20 years or so, the growth of data collection in the private sector has largely been viewed through the privacy landscape. So those of us in the policy space, in the legislative consideration of issues related to the collection and use of big data, usually it's been viewed in that policy framework through risks to personal privacy. What does the collection of big data sets and the use of large data sets do to personal privacy? That conversation has also historically focused on the role of government surveillance. In other words, what are democratic countries and also non-democratic countries, what are they doing with information that is available to the private sector that they have access to on the democratic side through lawful means, through lawful access according to legal frameworks, and then on the authoritarian or less democratically functioning countries, what do they demand from the private sector or private entities to provide to them for government surveillance? So much of the conversation in the policy space has always looked at those issues from the perspective of what does it do to individual personal privacy. What we've seen then now over the last 15 to 20 years is that as more of our information has migrated into the digital space, that information becomes at greater risk for being accessed in an unauthorized use, stolen, manipulated, or exploited. And so that has presented additional issues when we talk about risks from bad actors, whether those are state sponsors or whether those are criminal activities. But all of these issues have basically been analyzed from the perspective of what does that do to personal privacy? How is our personal privacy jeopardized when information is accessed or used in some unauthorized way? From a national security perspective, especially myself coming from a government background, having spent time in government throughout the 2000s working on surveillance and related privacy and civil liberties issues, the U.S. government has often viewed the collection of information from a a pro-national security perspective. In other words, the collection of data has been available to governments for lawful access to conduct intelligence activities or investigative activities or other law enforcement functions. Again, the key from the U.S. perspective is that access has been lawful access. But in the meantime, the continued threats from a cybersecurity perspective have just been pervasive. And there's two recent expositions that I want to just mention that I think will frame our conversation some. One has to do with a recent exposition that was put in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report, which was a public-private, it was a government-mandated congressional study that was done and congressional review that was done over the course of the last year, which looked at governance in cyberspace from the U.S. government perspective. And that report lays out in great detail the major cyber activities, in particular from actors like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and how those malign cyber activities have just been pervasive. In addition to the state actor, also into additional cyber attacks and invasions into data, we've also seen in recent years the what I'll call the exploitation of data. And so the other exposition government study that I wanted to mention is the work that came out of the Senate Intelligence Committee in its review of election interference in the 2016 election. So that involved not necessarily the stealing of data or damage to data, but the manipulation and the exploitation of the vast amounts of data that Americans are giving to the technology sector on a voluntary basis. And in the review that the Intelligence Committee conducted, we saw how that information can be manipulated or used to undermine elections and to undermine democratic processes. So based on these pervasive and persistent threats to data theft and the exploitation of citizens' data that's contained on tech platforms, in my view, we need to start thinking about, and so that's part of what this conversation is about, we need to be thinking more about whether or not the balance has shifted to national security opportunities and the use of such data by governments to be able to protect their populace, to instead a potential paradigm where these vast collections of data, the existence of so much data about Americans in particular, but also this applies to other countries as well, so much citizen data residing in platforms and in private sector entities where it can be accessed, hacked, stolen, manipulated, or exploited. And so I think that brings us to the question of whether or not the increase of this situation of data is becoming more of a national security threat, and we need to start talking about it in that context. So for those interested, I've first provided some of these observations in remarks at Georgetown Law in the spring of 2020 and published on Lawfare, and as if we potentially in the U.S. government were going to see some legislative activity on comprehensive privacy legislation. That didn't happen. But at the time, when we issued that paper that brief last spring, what we were trying to argue, what I was trying to argue in that piece was that part of the privacy, if we're looking at comprehensive privacy legislation, part of that conversation should also include the national security risks that are presented by this greater collection and assemblage of data. So I'm delighted that both Professor Aaronson and my colleague Sarah Albrycht, who you're going to hear from in a few minutes, both have taken on this issue to look at it in different ways in their scholarship and writing this year. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to offer a few preliminary thoughts about things that we can potentially do about it. From the government surveillance perspective, what I would suggest is that we need to be conducting more rigorous risk assessments on the value of collection versus the risk of losing that data, as governments, the US government and others have demonstrated that they are currently incapable in some ways of protecting the loss of data, manipulation, or exploitation of data that's collected and retained. So I think one area that governments can look at is reevaluating their retention periods and how long they are holding on to information, even if it's collected for national security perspective. Also, from the government perspective, we need to take more of a look at the role of government in providing warning to citizens about how their information may be used or exploited by malign actors. And that's something, transparency about foreign influence is something that I'm going to be working on in my research over the next several months as well. And then from the private sector collection and retention perspective, we need to be looking at the regulatory environment. So far, this is an area we have not in the United States passed comprehensive privacy legislation. This is an area that it seemed last year that we were getting a little closer, and then those efforts fell off. What I would suggest is that it is unreasonable to expect the technology sector to completely regulate itself in this area. This is the reason that government exists, in order to regulate private behavior in accordance with our values and protection of national security. And so it really is an area where if we want companies to handle information in a different way, including in a way that is more protective of the potential national security equities, then it's going to be an area that is going to be needed legislative action or more regulatory action. So those are my preliminary thoughts. Hopefully that starts off the conversation. And now I'll turn it over to one of my other colleagues.
Thanks very much for that, Carrie. A very erudite set of remarks, and it's interesting because typically when one thinks about national security in this space, your mind goes to cybersecurity, keeping the bad guys out and remediating once they get in. But what you're talking about is actually the dynamic interplay between data, privacy, and cybersecurity, which is not often thought about in that way. So I think that was a really, really great way to start things off. Sarah, we're going to turn to you now for your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My national security lens comes from nearly 25 years serving as a police officer in the United States Army. And so I'm here today as a military fellow. Certainly my views don't represent those of the United States Army or the Department of Defense. But as I looked at security, I mostly dealt with physical security, which is protecting people or things through uses of barriers or fencing. And the focus of my job was there. This changed in about 2009 when I went to Northern Command, which is responsible for the protection of the United States. And I worked in an area called critical infrastructure protection, which basically makes sure that those things which are required to carry out the critical missions of the United States are protected. And while I was there, the Chelsea Manning WikiLeaks thing happened, and we started looking at data security very differently. We knew that we had people in the military who had ideas that were outside of what we'd want them to be, and that our data was not necessarily always secured, and that the things that they were saying and doing were being collected, but not by us. And that it was very hard to understand necessarily what was going on with those soldiers' online activity. And that's for good reasons. Carrie would tell you that most people believe that their conversations have a certain level of privacy to it. But what was becoming obvious to us as we tried to coordinate and understand what was happening with soldiers' activity was that privately held data and the people that held that were certainly moving at a faster pace than we were. And in 2012, I started working for a criminal investigative organization that basically does felony level crime investigation for the United States Army. And I spent a lot of my time spending money on increasing storage for things like PCs. And what we saw between 2012 and when I left that organization again in 2019 was really a change from PC type computing to mobile computing. And the difference there is the amount of data that we started having to collect. So we had forensic examiners that would look at the digital side of cases for digital evidence. And we had a few people who could do that back in 2012. And when I left in 2019, we were building our own labs. We had people that we had training programs for. I was spending my money buying terabytes of storage so that we could continue this. And basically what we found over time was that these examiners, while very talented, really couldn't keep pace with the people who were trying to hide their digital trail when we were trying to catch their echoes. So we did work hard, and in all fairness, when we worked with social media companies or internet companies, we would do that through legal means, and they would help us. But it is a very time-consuming process with a high barrier to enter, and it took months to get that data. And so it didn't surprise me when I started seeing things like partnerships between data collection organizations and police departments. For example, you could look at the Amazon use of the Ring camera and donating them to police departments, where then police give those cameras out to neighborhoods with the understanding and agreement of the people who put them up that they can access that feed. And that becomes pervasive surveillance. And when you add in the addition of body cameras that are being worn all the time, license plate readers, there's a lot of passive collection that's happening that people don't necessarily realize is going on. And when that happens, there's certainly a tendency to want to expand that use beyond what it was originally intended for. And so when I came to CNAS, I started looking at it from a surveillance perspective, because I had learned from another of my war times that authoritarian regimes could start using these things, which we are seeing in China with the Uyghur population, to monitor, track, and categorize people that are in their nation. And we can see that this has been done before. You can go to the Holocaust Museum and see how technology was used. You could see how the radio towers were used during the Rwanda genocide. And in fact, you can look at the United States, where we now admit that our census data was used to find Japanese Americans and inter them during World War II. So we're looking at COVID patient tracking right now. And the reason is it's become so ubiquitous to track people through their data that it's easy to access. But the barrier for law enforcement has typically been fairly high. And so when a social media company or someone else can, with the click of a button, know vast amounts of information about you, can use that data to target you with ads generally, or can sell that data so others can target you, monitor your communication, your location, it goes on and on, we start thinking, well, where's the danger in this? And so I thought, well, if authoritarian regimes are willing to use this against their own government or against their own people, why would they not be willing to use it against us? And a news article popped up, and I saw it, and I didn't get this through military channels, but a unit in the 82nd Airborne was targeted, it appears, with some malicious emails that got sent back to family members. It looks like potentially through an email server that was not a military server, but a morale type of server. And I thought, well, there it is. And when you look at the problem with when we talk about military families being targeted, there's a lot of complications that go with that, because military families are not located necessarily on military installations. They're not necessarily under the auspice of the authorities that we have to operate. So we have to think about how do we get after that? And so we really, I took a step back and said, how do we do that? And I looked at the types of cyber crimes that were already happening in the world. So I stepped back into my policing role. And in fact, a lot of the things that could be used to target individuals within our network, our military network, are already being done to our to many underserved populations out there through doxing or monitoring through camera systems or through GPS data. And if it can be done already, generally because people have access and information. So if you think about the person who sets your Nest camera up in your home, maybe your boyfriend did it and you break up and then they're watching or monitoring through it. They have that access and information. But if our data, our individual data, even though people say that it's anonymized, when it's sent out, can be reallocated to our individual identity, which studies have been shown it can be. What if an enemy of the United States wanted to use that to target military people and in order to influence our personal actions? And so we always in the military say the most vulnerable part in our security chain is the individual. We have wonderful systems that look across vast swaths of territory and information, but what the individual does and how they react is the most vulnerable. And so it's easy to look at this as a potential risk to the military. And the most interesting thing to me was, we as the United States military have always relied on our geographic distance to afford us a safe and assured homeland. And with the digital world, that world affords no such safe zone. So we really have to look at what other people are doing, and the Department of Defense should absolutely be looking at ways to get into this discussion about data security and data privacy so that we can retain, so we can keep its effect off of our force. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thanks very much for that, Sarah. And it's an interesting dynamic to look at it that way, where you say, we typically make sure that our troops have adequate kit when they're in the theater of operations. But what you're also saying is that the theater of operations has changed, and there's a real blurring between foreign and domestic, especially as it relates to our military operators. Very interesting set of points. Susan, we're going to pass it over.
Okay, so rather than have you watch me touch my face, I've got a short PowerPoint, and my paper focused on 3 key points. Can you all see it? Yeah? Okay, great. So this is not a new issue. We've known about it probably since 2012. And when I say we, I mean policymakers around the world. The US strategy has been incredibly different from any other nation, which is the United States has warned against apps, has banned some apps, and reviewed foreign investment in data-driven countries. But Canada, Germany, my other case study countries, have not. And these nations are more concerned about their lack of control over the infrastructure, the cloud. So I totally agree with Carrie and Sarah that data troves can be dangerous to national security, but I also think governments need to find ways to cooperate on shared interoperable policy solutions. So what do we mean by this national security threat? And so the threat can be indirect or direct, immediate or gradual. It can be presented by insiders or outsiders, such as foreign firms or adversaries, as both Sarah and Carrie noted. And it could be through all sorts of platforms, apps, widgets, or other enticing digital services. So honestly, this paper took me so much longer than many other papers I've written. And I think that's because at first I started looking at it through a total US lens, which was to a great degree a mistake. And so what I looked at is these 5 apps, 5 cases involving apps and social networks. And I'll show them to you in a second, where in each case, a US government actor found a national security risk or alleged it. And I want to stress that the effects of the risk were global, because all of these case studies are used globally, but the response to the risk was national, which obviously makes sense. That's how governments operate, but I don't think it's going to be effective in the long run. I'll talk about that. So here's the cases. And some of these are names that you're probably familiar with. So Facebook and Strava are both social networks. And Facebook has been a threat for an awfully long time because it doesn't adequately protect personal data, and it has not been regulated in any way in how it monetizes data. Strava was a threat because when it released a heat map that inadvertently exposed collective anonymized personal data, which analysts were able to use to find locations of military personnel. And this affected America's NATO allies. Face app. I don't know if you guys have heard about this app, but it is a photo app that basically took advantage of app permissions and used it to obtain all sorts of data. And the company happened to be located in Russia. So several members of Congress asked the FBI to investigate it, and that study's not done, but some app stores banned the app. ToeTalk, probably most people have not heard of this company, but it is one of the largest free messaging apps and is available in countries where messaging apps are often not available, such as the UAE. And it happened to have been an app that the UAE developed to surveil its own citizens and their friends, allies around the world, which is shocking that that's okay to do. And then finally, TikTok, which is one of the most downloaded apps globally, and I'm sure everybody's heard of it. And there the threat is kind of indirect and outsider, because I think the United States government and other governments are more concerned about its potential to be crossed with other data sets. So the US government response to each of these situations has been distinct, but no other nation has done what it's done. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically it's done nothing on Facebook and done little to change its behavior regarding monetizing personal data and protecting personal data. And, you know, I basically agree with Sacha Baron Cohen, who sees this as the greatest threat. It's a propaganda threat until it is regulated, both at the national level and international level. Strava, the US and other governments, including China, have banned military use of wearables, but they haven't banned the apps. FaceApp, the US government is investigating. ToeTalk, it's really interesting. The US government has done basically nothing about that. Allegedly, it's warned some of its allies about the app, but other governments have started to create similar apps that are surveillance apps, especially in the time of COVID-19. And then the other part of the US response, which I find totally puzzling, is, for example, I thought, gee, the Department of Defense, in the wake of all this, would become a huge advocate for personal data protection, but it hasn't been. It didn't work the US government has not worked to strengthen personal data protection regulations or to ensure that anonymization is effective, which is another strategy that you would think governments would be collectively pursuing. And then now, under the Trump administration, if foreign investors want to acquire companies with large stores of data, it must undergo Treasury Department review. So, okay, what have Canada and Germany done in response to it? They haven't banned a single app. They are more concerned about domestic law applying in the cloud, affecting the ability to control data. There's a T missing there. They fear more the loss of data and digital sovereignty. And both countries want to diversify away from the US cloud. And in fact, Germany has a plan. So my conclusion is US policymakers see a problem in the what and the how. Okay, they're not so concerned about how to make personal data protection more effective, but in who has access to the data and who owns the data. Canada and Germany are concerned in where and how personal data and official data is stored and processed. I believe all three nations must work together to update their approach to regulating the use of personal data, particularly related to, just as we have with social networks, right? We rely on private firms to police platforms. We rely on the app store providers and owners to police their platforms. And I would say they need more guidance because their response has been inconsistent. And we need to cooperate on interoperable and trusted policy solutions And the reason we need to do that is because, yes, I'm a national, but they're also global. Thanks so much for hearing me
Great,
out.
thanks very much for that, Susan. Really appreciated it. And so now we're kind of at the question and answer period of today's session. And so, as I'd indicated at the beginning, you have the opportunity to pose questions to the panelists through their question and answer function at the bottom. We have a few questions that come in. I'll just read them to you. And this question goes to all panelists. And what we'll do is we'll answer, and I'll just read the question verbatim. Corporate giants such as Facebook, Amazon, Google have gathered user data for years through AI analytics, heavy embedding of cookies, for example. Would you please elaborate on the challenges that the federal and state governments are facing with regard to updating laws to better protect data, users, and also to maintain a fair playing field for businesses and competitors?
Thanks. Okay, so thanks for the question. So I'm just gonna look at the question one more time here that I have up on the screen. So there is a difference between the federal government regulation side and the state government regulation side. In the United States, what we're seeing is that states have tried to step in on their own. And so, for example, when it comes to notifying users when there's been a data breach, we have 50 different state regulatory regimes and what we call data breach notification laws. Some states are more similar than others, but there's all these different rules that apply. That doesn't really meld well with the nature of the companies that are doing the business or the users either. And so the United States, though, has not yet and this is data breach notification law is just one small piece of the potential areas where the federal government could act. It's probably one of the more, from a legal perspective, more straightforward pieces that the federal government could act. It would streamline things for companies that do business nationally, which of course many of the technology platforms, they're available to users no matter which state they're in. So, so that's one area where we just simply haven't seen the federal government step in and regulate in an area that is kind of crying out for it. There is a difference between the regulation that goes on, the way that the United States approaches it versus other countries, because we do have companies that are operating nationally, companies that are operating globally, and there is a different constitutional framework, for example, versus the European Union and how they view privacy. I think one of the challenges at the high level that has taken place in the US legislative efforts, however, is just what I was trying to describe at the beginning, which is that the issue has been presented as only relating to personal privacy. So whenever these regulatory or legislative proposals have been put forth about why additional rules of the road are necessary and why some of those need to be baked into laws, it's presented as this very narrow issue of, well, that's because it's for personal privacy. What we're trying to suggest is that it's much bigger than that. And so the federal government and legislators should be energized to act on this issue, because there are also, as Sarah Albrycht described, force protection issues that are involved. There are also, as Susan described, other threats that are involved. And so there's a bigger national security picture. I think that if those national security equities were articulated in a more consistent, vocal, and clear way, we might be able to explain and generate more of the conversation regarding potential legislation than what has been up until now primarily a focus on personal privacy.
Yeah, Carrie, I look at this, I'm not a law professor, but I look at it from exactly what you were saying, which is a force protection concern. And as you gathered user data for years, how would that data then be used to locate individuals, locations, or efforts that could be counter to national security? So I don't know exactly how you'd update the law, but what I would say is that when you talk about how the data is used, how it's meshed together, and how much we're protecting individual identities within it or locations within it, is something that we need to take a look at. Susan?
So I look at it a bit differently as someone who only went to law school for a day and a half, basically, which is, okay, so what is data? Is it personal property? Or, and I think this is a huge debate, which we don't have the time to get into, but I do think different cultures have adopted different approaches to this issue. The issue being, okay, if we can define what data is it labor? Is it property? Is it an asset? Once we get beyond that, we have to think about how do you correct it if it's wrong? How do you use it? Who can monetize it? Who owns it? And who can control it? And honestly, there aren't shared norms on this. And that's what we found in an earlier research project on barriers to digital trade flows. And so in 1995, the Clinton administration posited this global framework for the internet. And they said, we need to find internationally accepted principles that build trust, including that protect personal data. And while there isn't a consensus on the how, there is that consensus starting in the 1990s. To diss the Trump administration, they've totally abandoned that. In fact, left these things out of the latest trade agreements. And so I would like to see a refocus on these principles. The United States has to move forward on some form of personal data protection law, if only to provide clarity to market actors regarding what they can't and can't do in data.
Thanks for that, Susan. Our next question comes from Michael Garcia, who's a senior policy advisor at Third Way. Michael's question is, the US government and technology companies or the technology community are considering contact tracing through applications. Obviously, this is in the context of COVID-19. He then goes on to say, yet privacy reasons exist for the reasons you all just articulated. Privacy reasons are present that we need to consider. Learning from the Patriot Act and other surveillance measures post 9/11, what is the best way to protect user data to conduct contact tracing that doesn't require a United States government or a tech company to host the data? Would a blockchain be the best solution? Carrie, do you want to take a crack at that?
So, so I want to speak to it from a governance perspective, not necessarily from the technology piece of how it would work, because I think the technology piece is best posed to a technologist, and I'm not a technologist, but I do want to speak to a lesson from the post 9/11 surveillance framework, which is an area that I've spent a lot of time in, both when I was in government and then on the outside, which is that from a legislative and a governance perspective, for me, one of the biggest lessons from the reaction to some of the post 9/11 surveillance activities was the lack of transparency about what the law was authorizing. I think much of the reaction to some of, if we talk about the phone records program, with a counterterrorism phone records program, which is an area that certainly folks at Third Way and throughout the policy community are very familiar. Those activities, even though they were briefed to certain members of Congress who were in a position to receive that information in their capacities on the intelligence or perhaps the judiciary committees, the way that the law was being interpreted and used was not widely understood, even amongst people who would consider themselves policy and legal experts in the broader academic and outside advocacy communities. Where I think a lot of the reaction came to was that legal authorities were being used in a way that were not transparent, even amongst experts, certainly not transparent to the public. Now, there could be national security arguments made certainly in the immediate time frame after September 11th why that was the case, but as time went on, there wasn't. And there also was a specific national security threat. So for the present, I think one of the most important things that needs to happen, to the extent that these types of technologies and apps are going to be used in the coronavirus or other public health areas to protect public health, is the way that both private sector and government are using this information needs to be in a legal framework and needs to be understood how they're being used, and users need to understand that. Where I think we'll run into trouble and where there will then be a backlash is if these technologies are used and all of a sudden the incredible breadth of data that is available on citizens' mobile devices, if that information is being provided to government entities that citizens are not aware of, if they're private health information because people track all sorts of personal health information for their own purposes on their devices, if that information is being extracted without their knowledge and without them actually understanding it, I think that for me is the larger governance lesson from that prior era that we need to apply, and we need to recognize that these decisions are being made right now. So it's difficult because on one hand, we have this current national crisis going on, and we have so many Americans suffering and dying on a daily basis from this, but we actually, as for those of us who are working in policy and technology and legislative areas, we actually can't just wait and not pay attention to this particular issue. It needs to be addressed in real time.
That's a fair point. And I'm going to there's another question that's kind of in line with this from Ines Jordan Zub. So I'm going to kind of riff off that. There they raised the South Korean and Taiwanese case study. And the question wonders how the data will be used, how it will be secured, and more precisely, and this is to Susan and Sarah, what are the long-term national security risks of this kind of broad sweeping data collection in terms of COVID? Because it's easy to grab emergency powers, but oftentimes it's hard to give them back. So Susan, why don't we?
I don't have expertise on that, but history teaches us that exactly what you said, that once governments get that power, they've got the information and they will not give it up very easily. Sarah?
My perspective on this, again, I lean on my policing background where the more data that you have, the more likely you are to use it. And I think it goes back to what Carrie said is, how are we putting a framework around this data? How long will it be kept? What will it be used for? And specifically, when it comes to any kind of surveillance, because this is a kind of surveillance, you have to think about what you're actually collecting and from whom. So if it is a opt-in program or it is a wherever the hotspots are program, whose data is being collected? And is there an inherent bias being collected with that data? And I think that you can come up with outcomes from the data that may be colored simply by what you collected, from whom and where. And that is a problem that is pervasive amongst a lot of surveillance and policing programs.
No, and there's an interesting question from Thomas Strentz that comes kind of nicely on the heels of that. So Thomas asked, what about data brokers? Earlier this year, the New York Times reported that US law enforcement agencies are effectively circumventing the Carpenter ruling. And that is a ruling which requires warrants for data access for location data by buying such data from data brokers. In your opinion, should this practice be outlawed or regulated going forward? So the real question then becomes, what of law enforcement of this? If we willfully give this information over to a private sector actor and it's commercially available, why would law enforcement need a warrant if others don't? Sarah, did you want to come in on that?
I think Carrie's probably better qualified to answer about circumventing the Carpenter ruling, but I'd be happy to follow up.
Sure, Carrie, do you want to try it? Do you want to take a shot at that one?
So again, I think this is an area, so the court ruled in Carpenter that provides additional requirements, but there also just is this legislative area where Congress has not acted. So I think there have been different reports over time and news reporting and other reporting that looks at this data broker market in particular. Third-party data certainly is the area that is crying out for legislative activity. The courts can address things as best they can, but the court's decisions are always going to be focused on a particular narrow application. And as we know, when it comes to technology, law often is lagging way behind. And so it's just, when it comes to third-party data, data brokers, this realm of where information ends up in a way that the users are not aware, it requires greater legislative action. So I think also I saw Susan wanting to comment, so I'll.
Thanks. So basically, in an earlier iteration of this article, I looked at the data broker market because it seemed to me that that's a large part of where the problem lies. And only one state in the United States, Vermont, has tried to regulate data brokers. Now that's an industry that's been around since the 1920s when credit first became widespread in the United States and in other countries. And this sector is built on opacity. So whatever we can do to make the market for data, to get more information about data brokers, that would be extremely helpful. We also tried to look at it in Brazil for an earlier study, and it's about the same. There's very little information about how they get their information because the market for data is opaque. No one knows the price of data, how much the supply of data is, the quality of that data, since we have no rules regulating our ability to correct our own data. And we've seen problems with that. So this to me seems something at the national level that could easily be done. Sarah, your turn.
So my concern with a lot of the data that's out there, and particularly when police departments start being wooed by technology companies on specific kinds of things or tools that they can use, is that does that department have the capability to understand the algorithms behind the data, the ways in which the data is being used and how it's coming to its conclusions. So if you don't have somebody who's a statistician or somebody who understands AI, or even a lawyer who understands the legal uses of these, you can get information, you can get data, you can get tools, but what are, like I was saying before, the built-in biases that come with those tools? Particularly in law enforcement, most of our data comes from criminal activity, and criminal activity is heavily based off of enforcement. So where we enforce crime, we have criminals, and that is based upon many years of decisions within communities about where they're going to police and why. And so when we extrapolate that information and then try to use it in a new way, we have to be extremely careful with the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and if we're actually achieving them with the data that we're being given by these companies who are trying to sell us something.
Oh, thanks for that, Sarah. And I want to come back to something, a thread that kind of ties all three of your remarks together. And it was one word that Susan used, opacity, right? Around data collection, data use practices, and data brokerage. And I'm struck by something, right? If you think about the principles that we have in democratic society, they're principles like openness, transparency, accountability. If one wants to pass a law, you go through a democratic process. The law is debated publicly, it's published publicly, everyone knows what it is, it's subject to judicial review and separation of powers, and all of that. And so this kind of segues into a question from Mazuli Mokazoma, who said, would it be fair to claim that private organizations like Facebook now own citizen data from all over the world in many nations, and they have access to more data than countries and more government than governments? Are these actually a new form of global governance systems, and are these a new form of global leaders? Susan, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I mean, there are several books now out about Facebook and Google as as governance entities. You're probably familiar with the war and how Google's been challenged on maps, Amazon's been challenged, because they played the role of basically governance entities because their maps are essentially ruling. There's been satellite issues regarding territory, that these companies have made business decisions that are essentially governance decisions. And, if I could, I would ask Congress to hold a testimony on the governance implications of relying on firms to make decisions about things like app permissions in my paper. There's a lot of literature and efforts to try to reform the governance process related to social networks. Facebook is set up an almost judicial body to make decisions on content. So yes, they are. And I think that that's really frightening because whatever data is, right? If it is infrastructure, if it is labor, if it is a form of, if it is an asset, whatever it is, and that's going to vary in multiple circumstances, it has value, both the person whom the data, organization or organizations that seek to monetize it. And we have to regulate it. And that regulation needs to be transparent and equitable. Someone else brought up the point about people don't really understand the implications of their data, even when anonymized. And we need to train people in understanding that data has value and they need greater means of control over that data.
Aaron, if I can comment on that as well, because I think you've honed in on a really critical point in this conversation, which is that companies are not governments. And despite the fact that the tech sector has, on one hand, the tech sector has provided this incredible innovation, opportunity, employment, changed the nature of the way that we work, obviously, as we're all even finding out in this current crisis. But the private sector, which is the backbone of our American economic system, has different motivations than governments do. They have a different role. They have a different function. And it is, from my perspective, unreasonable to expect that companies will make decisions when they have fiduciary responsibilities to potentially shareholders or owners, that they will make decisions that are based on US or some other country's national security interests. That's not really the job of companies. In the surveillance environment, companies cooperate with lawful requests from government to assist. And so there is a role, an important one, I would suggest,
what Carrie was saying, which is follow the law, because when you use your data or information and it puts the greater government at risk, you have to be able to have some hold over it. And when we look at the very simple ends, ways, and means, if we have to start consulting companies in order to execute those, it is changing what global governance looks like. I think an interesting caveat off of that is, do these companies provide platforms that create movements that change global governance? That is a possibility and a different way to look at kind of a digital soft power.
Thank you for that. And so maybe I'll make one comment, and then we've got probably time for one more question, then we'll have to close. And a colleague of mine who sits on the board at CIGI, Melissa Hathaway, wrote a brilliant paper for us, the thesis of which was we were basically putting extremely buggy software and devices into our environment, and we're building a vulnerable future for ourselves. And she said that, patching our future is dangerous. And she's also said before that Patch Tuesday leads to Vulnerable Wednesday. And so the question that I want to ask comes from Indira Klein, and it's about smart cities, because this is now it transverses from the digital into the physical very quickly when one thinks about smart cities. The question is this: smart cities possess massive amounts of data where tension exists with regard to ownership of data, government, tech, partners, investors. Any thoughts on best practices in addressing data ownership, control to include citizen input, and updating citizens of the process? And I will add my point to that, which is, and also the cybersecurity surrounding the devices that are making up the backbone of the IoT. And please proceed in any order you wish, panelists.
I did look at the Smart Cities Initiative, particularly in Hong Kong when the protests were going on, and they had some new updated smart poles put in, and when they were put in, because they thought that the data that was being collected was too specific. So they supposedly dumbed down the smart pole to create less, so the pictures weren't as stark. I've had the wrong term there, but they stripped some of the Bluetooth data away so that you couldn't see all of that. But again, that was all being done within the system, and people didn't get to choose whether their Bluetooth signal got picked up as they were monitoring traffic flow. And so when you saw the protests happen, you saw people pulling down what they thought were smart poles. Some of them were, some of them weren't, because they didn't want their data being collected. So it's just, it's interesting that people, the minute that there was let's just say, difference of opinion on what should be being done in terms of governance, that one of the first things they looked at was how to take those systems out, or how to hide themselves from those systems. So that's how to control that. Do people opt in? A sliding set of controls that you can put on it.
Susan?
I'll take it from here. First, I just want to thank everybody involved with this and my fellow data divas. Thank you for your feedback here, and thank you to the audience. Don't you all think that since data is changing our economy and polity, it's time that we rethink how we govern data? And to me, smart cities are the epitome of that. Last week we had a webinar on it, and to me, it's not so much about the economics of it, but it's about how that threatens democracy. And I just hope, as a result of these kind of discussions, people will say, I need to learn more about whether or not this is really worth it. Does it really improve governance in cities? Or is it a way for private sector to take over some of the functions of cities and ultimately maybe federal governments? We'll see. Carrie?
I think that's a good wrap. Susan, thank you so much for inviting me to join you and CNAS to participate along with Sarah in this. It's a really important conversation. It's an area crying out for legislative activity and engagement by policymakers. I worry that because United States government is often crisis-driven and our legislative activities are often responsive to crises, and we currently certainly are in such a tremendous national crisis and a national tragedy, that these types of issues will get pushed to the side and not be dealt with. But it really is important because, as one of the questioners pointed out, these issues are very relevant to our current crisis, and we can't set them aside for too long. I really hope that we can find ways for movement to take place on these issues before, and sort of stay ahead of getting ahead of why they're needed. We can't afford for things to just wait for the next crisis before legislative or regulatory activity takes place.
Anyone want to add anything? Aaron?
Well, maybe just one kind of parting set of thoughts. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I thought the questions that came from the audience were insightful and informed, and I think they sparked a really interesting conversation. I'd like to thank the speakers. I mean, I thought that this was a really engaging and thoughtful kind of unpacking of issues around security and privacy and the dynamic. And I also struck by the fact that there's a lot we have to do. I think we need to get real actual governance frameworks up and running as quickly as we possibly can, because the status quo is simply not sustainable. As I'd indicated earlier, we are in our own failure if we continue down this path, because patching our future is dangerous. And the only other thing I would say, Susan, is that that we have more of these webinars coming. So I just want to ask people to join the Hub and CIGI for some upcoming webinars. One will be focusing on the pandemic and its effect on digital rights, and that's on April 30th. And the next will be Rethinking Privacy in the Time of the Pandemic, which is on May 7th. But thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to all of our speakers.
Email, and thank you so much for participating. Have a great day, everyone.